Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're here in the house of Professor Sir George Radda, a leading scientist for many years, an administrator in UK science and some international science bodies. We're here to find out a little bit about his life in science. George, welcome. So you were born in Hungary in 1936. Can you tell us a little bit about being brought up in Hungary?
I brought up in Hungary as a youth post the Horthy regime, which was a fairly brutal regime run by Admiral Horthy,
Yes.
who was the head of state and an admiral of the navy, which in Hungary was non-existent, but it had an admiral. There was a new government, basically, and we were brought up in essentially state system.
Yes.
And I went to school in an elementary school in my place of birth, Dieu, for about 10 years,
Right.
from 6 years onwards, and still keep up with one or two of the former pupils of that school now. They were all mates at a very early stage. He told me how we used to play together as kids,
Right.
and what were our favorite things to do during the day. But essentially, it was a very uneventful school
Right.
where we got a reasonable kind of education. The important change was the schooling system halfway through.
Right. And are you still in touch with these contemporaries, and do they still live in Hungary?
Yes.
Oh, right.
His name is Attila Bécsi,
Right.
and that's the same name as his father, who was headmaster of this school,
Of the school.
at the
Yes.
time I was going
there. Yes.
And we were really very good friends. I lost friendship or lost altogether from him until he just emerged and say, by the way, I'm still alive and I remember what we used to do.
Right.
And out came an email just to say, can we make up the difference? And so we
Yes.
corresponded a bit of what we used to do.
Right.
I didn't remember awful lot of my elementary school,
Right. Okay.
because my next school age made such an impact on me that anything below that was a bit
Sure.
clouded.
So your next stage was you arrived at a Benedictine Abbey for
That was
your
the next
secondary
stage.
schooling.
In between a village school.
Right. Yes.
So during the war, my parents wisely left the big town and we lived in a tiny hamlet away from the village, which was very heavily bombed by the Americans because of the manufacturing capabilities in that town
Of course.
were used during the war. And we lived there and went to a local elementary school in one single class from 5 to 10 to 12.
Right.
And then the village school went on a bit, and we were not expecting to go to, if you like, a middle school or I suppose a public school or whatever you'd call it.
A secondary school. Yes.
It was a next stage. But what happened is unusual in history. The communist system abolished all religious schools and all private schools, and they were run under state control, except the bishops of Hungary and the abbot of this abbey were so powerful people in the country that their plea to maintain the school at the Abbey open was eventually met.
Right.
And the Abbey school restarted in 1951, which happened to be extremely convenient, it was essentially the beginning of a 4-year course
Yes.
in a higher education school.
Yes.
And Pannonhalma was and is the premier educational establishment at that level. Still, the present government's members are all educated there.
Right.
The foreign
right.
minister, not the prime minister himself, but at least 4 or 5 ministers all come from there.
Right. Okay.
And there is a big fraternity of ex-Pannonhalma pupils
Of course.
who really
Of course.
provide some political strength in a very unpolitical, unstable society.
Right.
So
Okay.
that was the middle school.
Yes.
The important thing was that that was outstanding education.
Yes.
We
yes.
had basically fighting religious education. We had to listen to Darwin, we had to listen to other things, but very subtly, the Benedictine Abbey and its priests managed to sail this bad, difficult border of religion and communism.
Yes. Yes.
So they taught us religion,
yes.
we had religious classes, we learned about religious affairs, yet they did not ignore the communist influence.
Sure.
So they kept a wonderful education in terms of the balance of how you lived in a communist system with a belief in God
Right.
and,
Right.
and a belief in Catholicism.
Yes.
It was a fundamentally Catholic education,
Right.
but taken on by priests who were themselves educated in universities at the highest level.
Right.
So he had a mathematics teacher who was as good as you get anywhere in the world.
Right.
We
Right.
had a chemistry teacher
Right.
who did a wonderful chemistry experiment. So we learned a lot of science hidden behind this religious leadership.
And you were obviously interested in science.
I was interested in science, and because it was made interesting,
Right.
these chaps made it alive. You lived with that.
Yes.
You lived with science. At the same time, you went at 6 o'clock every morning to a mass. Each priest had to say a mass
Right.
every day at about 6 o'clock. And we as young boys went and served at these masses
Right.
doing that kind of thing. So it was life between religion, science, education, and
And
not at all sports.
sports. Okay.
I played football, ski, swimming, half a dozen other things.
Sounds already a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Okay.
so it was an all-round, you could say, scientifically based religious education.
Right. Okay. So this was this was early 50s, and then 1956 happened.
Yeah,
There was events in Hungary,
sure.
protest, uprising,
Yeah.
leaving Hungary. What memories do you have of having to leave Hungary?
Yeah. Well, this was, of course, the first hurdle was to get into university. Coming from a middle class, we were not entitled to go to university. The only people from my class who were able to get a place, who were top at every school from 5 onwards until the finishing at Pannonhalma. And on that reason, they picked up about 2 or 3 people from the middle classes who were fortunate enough to end up at university.
Right.
We had 1 year at university, before 1956.
This was in Budapest, was it?
It was in Budapest.
Yes.
When came the disastrous revolution.
Right, yes.
Now that was October, mid-October, where all communist events that were, I think, important for the regime were celebrated in October. And this particular October celebration, where the university students were told they had to go, turned into a revolution.
Right.
Suddenly, in the middle of the events in the afternoon, the students started to pull down the statues of Stalin, laying down flags, and start chanting songs against the regime, and eventually occupied the radio station.
And you were active in this?
I was there at the thing in October in the square where it started, and by about 7 o'clock in the evening, the students got so angry that they raided their own student weapon stores. As students in university, we had to do military.
Of course.
And so the universities were equipped
with
for
weapons.
Military education.
Yes.
And we broke into these and got a hold of whatever rifles and everything else was good at. And that's when actual fighting started.
Right.
And the Hungarian army was initially resisting, but gave in very quickly. They went on the side of the revolutionary students. And the Russians withdrew because they weren't ready for a brutal shutdown. So they left Hungary and ostensibly to come back and negotiate.
Right.
During the next 10 days, or 5 to 10 days, the Hungarian leadership was formed, new leadership, and they sent their top representative, who was the top general in their army, to negotiate with the Russians peace so that it can have a normal life. And he never came back. So having had lost the leadership,
yes,
the Russian tanks started at the border on November the 5th, queued up and came in the 6th and brutally, internally just shot the city apart.
Yes, yes.
Hundreds of students killed in events where they continued to their revolution, and many people made homeless and many houses destroyed.
Right,
We saw almost the extreme that we saw recently.
Yes.
Elsewhere. But it was a typical Russian march of a huge convoy of tanks.
Tanks, yes, yes.
That occupied the capital
yes.
and some of the major cities in a day's running and shot to pieces.
Right.
And the students and the people continued the revolution, and the Hungarian army joined the revolution.
At that time.
So the fighting continued for about a month.
Right.
And during that month, all things have happened. They could, and I suppose 20,000 students and probably 100,000 people has left.
Right. So you decided at that time you had to leave.
That there was no future.
Yes.
There was no future for science.
Right.
That was the main thing. No future there to find any kind of serious scientific or intellectual activity for that matter. So I decided to leave, and my parents insisted, particularly my father, that if I leave, I take my siblings with me. So my little brother and my older sister came with me.
Right.
We went out penniless, with nothing even a package of shirts or anything.
Right,
Just simply
right.
left as
Yes.
we were.
Yes, yes.
And
you went to Austria?
we went to Austria.
Yes.
And we ended up in, well, many Hungarians ended up lots of camps.
Sure,
But we were fortunate that through the Benedictines, we had links in Vienna.
Right, right.
And so they helped us out for the first few days
Sure.
to eat
Sure.
and maybe even buy some clothes
Yes,
and
yes.
trying to direct us or send us towards possible future
Yes.
opportunities.
Yes. So here you are in Austria, you're now a refugee. How did you manage to come to England and Oxford?
Well, I first sent my sister to go off with some friends to Belgium. We were
Right.
going to look after her.
Yes.
I sent my little brother to a wealthy manufacturer in Austria who said, I'll look after him for the rest of his education. And when you have done that, you can do what you like.
Right.
And I started to go around Vienna and see there were people by now, sending delegations from different countries to interview not just students but refugees of
Yes.
all kinds,
Yes.
to see if they can have them to go to their countries.
Yes.
And among them was an English delegation from Oxford, it happened, a professor of Hungarian in Oxford.
In Oxford, right.
He taught Hungary,
Right.
Hungarian,
Yes.
so he could speak it.
Yes.
And a couple of other professors. And I bumped into a writer, a journalist, and he said to me, you know, I know some English people, they're up in that attic, 3 of them, they're interviewing potential students. Why don't you go up there?
Right.
So I found this attic somewhere, the outskirts of Vienna. So they went, I said, I'm a student. And they said, come in. And I carried out a long interview and decided that I was ready to leave Vienna
Yes.
and go to Hungary.
You could go to Oxford,
England.
and in particular to Merton College.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was ready, there were, I think, 7 or 8 flights from Gatwick Airport, which is now Blackbush Airport, Red Cross flights
Right.
taking groups of students to England, all
Right.
landing in London.
Right.
So I was on a flight with 40 other students from a Red Cross,
Right.
Plane.
Okay. Yes.
and we landed in London at midnight. They put us up in a hotel, and the next day we were all bused to Oxford Youth Hostel,
Right. Right.
just for accommodation.
Yes.
And the
yes.
Oxford College started
Yes.
to look at those. And there were about 30 of those students who ended up in that group.
Right.
They were all interviewed by colleges,
Yes.
including Merton. And they selected 4
Right.
students,
Well,
and I was one of them.
you're one of them.
So I was very lucky.
Yes.
And
So,
I ended up in Merton.
yes. So, former refugee, coming from Hungary, with an education at an upmarket Benedictine Abbey. You're fluent in Hungarian, Italian, and German, but not in English. How did you make the transition? Must be very
Well,
difficult.
That was actually, by now, by all books, a historical moment of how an extremely well-educated chemistry tutor in Merton dealt with these potential refugees.
Right.
I think he interviewed 3, all 3 who were left behind.
Yes.
As you say, there was only one language he could speak, and that was English.
Yes.
And I had choices, but he didn't. So he in the end decided what we learned was chemistry.
Right.
So he got out the periodic table out of his bookshelf and asked me to point out what relates to what and what the elements were linked
Yes,
up and
yes.
how they were forming compounds,
Yes.
or in just sign language and diagrams.
Right.
So I was the student chosen by the periodic table as its language.
Right. Right. Well, that's very interesting.
And with the proviso that I could, this was done on this happened to be somewhere around the 14th of December.
Right.
With the proviso that the term started this teaching year 15th of January, and by then I have to at least speak elementary English and be able to write essays every week.
So 4 weeks, basically, 4 weeks.
And I did.
And you managed it. Right.
It was natural. First of all, there was no other choice for language.
Sure, sure.
Secondly, very wisely, the leadership of the college, the so-called postmaster general who looked after students, was wise enough to put me in a room that I shared with an English student. From the morning I got up,
you had to speak English.
I had to speak English.
Yes, yes.
And secondly, they did put on classes every day.
Right.
And so taught classes living around you and learning 400 words a day,
right.
which was my aim.
Right.
I spoke enough English to function in a chemistry school.
So that meant you were working for a chemistry degree, part 2, and one of your lecturers at that time was Rex Richards.
Yes.
And this is the first time you met Rex as a lecturer.
Yes.
That must have been the start of a long-term relationship.
Well, it was partly that, but I think more than that, he was not only a lecturer, he was actually one of my examiners.
Oh, right, right.
And I was on borderline between a top class and second class degree.
Right.
But the chemistry school has something called a part 2 part, which is an experimental thesis. And that turned out to be, by the judgment of the judges, including Rex, quite outstanding for an undergraduate.
Oh, good.
And that pulled me up.
Yes.
And that was organic chemistry, physical organic chemistry.
Right.
I learned techniques during that year. I learned new concepts during that year. And I learned the direction I was going to take on.
Right. So you've all this academic work, learning English, part 2 chemistry. How did you keep in touch with your family? Were your parents still alive at this time?
For years we didn't know, and they didn't know that we were alive.
Right.
So there was no news exchange. And then after about, I would say 2.5 to 3 years, the postal system managed to somehow catch up, and get beginning to get news that there is a Hungarian student doing chemistry in Oxford, and there weren't that many. So
of course, yes, yes.
And the family picked it up. They eventually traced my sister from families, and so it's through my parents desperately trying to find us.
Right.
And that made the contact.
Right.
And the first contact and the first message that we are alive and well and doing okay.
That must be very reassuring.
And stuff. But I think the student community was remarkably good to the refugees.
Right.
You know, you would have thought they didn't want to know.
Yes.
But in fact, they were more than generous.
Well,
The Oxford students set up a big fund, and part of it was funding me.
For funding you, yes, yes. So, we're now going to move on to 1962. You've now got a DPhil in chemistry,
Yeah.
and you have a chance of a Fulbright scholarship at UC Berkeley.
All right, that's right.
Now, I understand that you got support for this from a cabinet minister.
Yes,
Could you tell us a little about
The
that?
reason was that the chance was really so good. It was Melvin Calvin,
Yes,
who had
that's right.
happened to win the Nobel Prize the year before
Yes,
for photosynthesis.
yes,
And he was happy to take me on,
right,
and was even able to make some contribution to funding, but not allowed by any means, it was American law, to employ people who were
stateless, refugee, yes.
So it's a long story which I can tell briefly. And it starts with a typical Oxford dinner. Head of my college, Mr. Muir, a lovely old man. He was the head warden of Merton. And I said to him, I had this tremendous opportunity to go to his famous scientist, but I won't be allowed to because I will be stateless and I need to become English.
Right, yes.
And I said, well, he said, I know it usually takes years, but we'll see what we can do. He said, I tell you what, tomorrow evening we had Reggie. Reggie happened to be Reginald Maudling,
A cabinet minister.
Colonial secretary
Yes.
at the time. Reggie was dining tomorrow, and he said, why don't you bring us the brandy after dinner and just offer some brandy, which I duly did. And he went to Reggie and said, Reggie, my boy, this man needs to become English, and quickly. And Reggie said, well, drop me a note in the house, will you? That was the words.
Yes.
Drop a note in the house. So I dropped in a note in the house that I was waiting for a naturalization, and it had to be done in 2 months if I was taking up a scholarship. And very briefly after that, I had an interview from the police, Oxford police, very, very long interview. What did I do with the communists? Did I ever shoot anybody?
Yes, of course.
Did I ever sit at the back of a tank?
Yes.
You know, all the other things. And I put his mind at rest that I was probably reasonably honest, but he couldn't say it. Anyway, he left it. At the end of the interview, he said to me, Sir, there's one thing I don't understand. Somebody, somewhere in this country is pushing your case very, very hard.
Right, well, that was good.
Now, that was Reggie, and I still have his letter that he wrote to Butler.
Right.
Butler was the Home Secretary
yes.
at the time, and his decision on naturalisation was his.
Yes.
And the usual civil service letter back. Of course, I cannot promise any privileges that I could provide in promoting your friend, etc., etc. But I will do my best.
Right. So, you were now naturalised.
Yes.
And then, well, you got married.
Yeah.
And the two of you went off to Berkeley.
That's right.
For 12, 18 months. And at Berkeley,
Well, in 2 months I continued my Part 2 research so that I continued to work in the lab for nothing.
Yes.
And just wrote up my thesis and things.
Right.
And then started in Calvin's lab, which was a joy.
Right.
Calvin was a great scientist.
Right.
I learned a lot of science from him, a lot of how you approach people, how you chose a problem.
Yes.
That was really his influence on that.
Yes.
And he always saw something good somewhere, and what could be very hard on you.
Right.
So he was an inspiration in seminars, typical American aggression, but at the same time it was such promotional literature, if you like.
Right.
That everybody loved him.
Yes.
And so I think I couldn't have chosen a better lab.
Right.
It was 1 year, and I learned. Well, he was a chemist by training, but most of his work was on photosynthesis and plants
Yes.
and plant biochemistry.
So you were moving from organic chemistry into more biological aspects of science.
Actually, in the last few months before I went, I started to do some biological equivalent of what my thesis was about.
Right.
My part of the thesis was
Yes.
aromatic substitution.
Right.
And I started to put in aromatic compounds into animals
Right.
and see whether the rules that I learned about ortho-para ratios
Yes.
or how the ligands went either
Yes.
here to there also apply to a living system.
Yes.
So that's what made my mind
Yes.
interesting.
And there was an early interest, an initial interest in NMR at Berkeley.
And that was purely accidental.
Accidental.
There was a chap called Klein.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very old and very experienced NMR chap. And in those days, one of the few labs where you still had already had a high resolution NMR system. And
Yes.
he was doing NMR on, as it happens, on flavins, which was not my other favorite molecule.
Right.
Because it was a light emitting and therefore relating to photosynthesis.
Of course.
But it
Of
was
course.
an all living system. And I was
Yes.
very interested to see what riboflavin was doing in the eye of the bush baby.
Right. Uh-huh.
You didn't know that I did.
I never knew you did anything on bush babies.
That the bush baby has a crystalline layer of riboflavin behind his retina.
Really?
Beautifully shiny. That's why the bush baby's eye is
So glisten. Yes.
lights up.
Yes. Yes.
And what this light does is converts light that you normally don't see, ultraviolet or low frequency as well, using the flavin spectroscopy properties to convert that into visible light.
Ah, right.
So
Right. Oh, I didn't know that.
Using a subsidiary from a compound I was very interested in, and I'm trying to understand this fundamental chemistry of how we can supply light to the rest of the eye,
Yes.
which
Yes.
actually I did with Calvin.
Yes.
And I went to him and said, I'd like to do that program. He says, great, wonderful. And we did a very nice paper,
Yes.
the first
Right.
photochemistry of flavin.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay.
So
So.
that's how I started biological thing. But basically from there on, I was very much caught up by a very trendy thing in biochemistry, and that was the role of ligands on activities of macromolecules.
Right. Right.
So it was all about feedback of
Right.
information from
Yes.
small molecules, information transfer, and knowledge bases
Right.
generated by the biochemistry.
Right.
So I started on one of the enzymes called glutamate dehydrogenase,
That's
which
right.
is one of these that controlled activities in
That's
the metabolic
right.
pathway. It's all about controlling.
Yes.
And that
And
was an
you-
interesting story with a guy, a single guy. His paper was really my first major paper coming out of my own career as a junior lecturer, I suppose.
This is at Oxford now.
Yeah.
We've moved now from Berkeley to
Back
Oxford,
to Oxford.
and you've immersed yourself in this new area of research.
Yeah.
You've also managed to have 3 children, roughly in the
Yes,
60s.
Merton took me up as a research fellow.
Yes,
And so I did this first piece of research on this enzyme.
correct,
And,
yes.
A recent issue of Biochemical Journal picked this particular paper as one of the really interesting and maybe visionary papers
Yes,
in the early days. And that was my very first paper
yes.
with a graduate
Yes.
student.
And
called George
Dodd. So this area of enzyme regulation,
That
you
was underlying most of the thing.
that's right. And
People like John Griffiths, who would be here, worked on using spin labels, using
Correct.
certain detectors of what happens to these enzymes when they are wrapped up into a more complex structure with glycogen. That was one of the next steps.
yes,
There were several other steps which led towards more and more complicated
right,
systems that tried to bring out the properties of individual components
yes,
who were
yes,
involved in making sure that things ran in a
right.
even way.
And you were using phosphorous NMR at this time for part of your studies on enzyme regulation.
Yeah.
This was in contrast to Rex Richards, who was using proton NMR
Yes.
to look at a similar area. But however, in the process of looking at these phosphorus-containing compounds, there was an in vivo sample put into the spectrometer.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, the physicists actually were running phosphorus on very old compounds.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that had phosphorus, they put into
They
the
tried,
machine,
yes.
and because it gave a signal.
Yes.
And I had biochemistry students working with me.
Mm-hmm.
People like Steve Busby,
Steve Busby,
who's
yes.
now a professor at Birmingham.
Yeah.
And they recognized that maybe that signal is quite interesting if you could look at these complex structures in living things,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to in things that John Griffiths looked at, which is so-called glycogen particles. Or
Yes, yes.
And it was Steve Busby who one day came down enthusiastic and said, why don't we take a piece of muscle and see if we can see these famous compounds in the muscle like ATP and phosphocreatine and phosphates
Yes.
from his phosphorus spectra in vivo in a living piece of muscle.
Yes.
And he went up to the chemist, the physicist, who of course all threw it out and said you cannot possibly put that sort of dirty system in these lovely clean
tubes,
that we have made
Yes.
to give you a good signal. But Steve was very
Persistent.
persistent, is
Yes.
the word. And he went away, cut a piece of muscle, put it in a spectrometer, and called that
And boom.
some beautiful spectra.
Yes.
And he couldn't get it for another year.
Really.
He saw this spectrum in first run, and it was in the first paper, but we couldn't repeat it. And it turned out we couldn't repeat it because we did the stupid biochemistry. We let those muscles run dry.
They were dead, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Instead of keeping them alive.
Alive, yes.
And so once you recognized that's all you needed to do, it was open to everything.
Yes. Yes.
And then from there on it was how to get things alive, as little as a piece of muscle,
Right.
as a piece as a beating heart, or all of these within a living animal. And then when we published the first paper on a living heart in an animal, and so the heart beating and these spectra showing it was all biochemistry all helping.
Changes in
And turned on
energetics.
the oxygen supply.
That's right.
And
Yes.
so it
Yes.
going away, turned the supply back and came back.
Yes.
She said,
Yes.
this is it.
Yes. Yes.
And I said, this will be a method before I die that we will be able to do on
Yes.
people.
Yes. Now, you said you put an animal heart in a spectrometer and kept it alive. Now, for those of us who know about high resolution NMR, we know that the bore of the magnet is relatively small, 56 millimeters perhaps.
Right.
But you managed to convince Oxford Instruments to build you a wide bore magnet of about, 120
Yeah, it was-
180,
yeah,
120 millimeters diameter,
Yeah,
so that you could accommodate the living organism. And the other thing that was important, you had to build the NMR technology, the RF probes, around the sample, as opposed to stuffing the sample into a standard piece of NMR hardware.
that's right.
And that took a lot of technical innovation.
Yeah, yeah,
So once you'd got the working on excised hearts, but living hearts,
yeah,
you now then wanted to put the technique
that's right.
into use with a live animal. You were lucky that NRDC, the National Research and Development Corporation in the UK, was interested in supporting new technologies in Britain. This is late 70s, early 80s.
Yes,
I worked with Oxford Instruments. We had a cooperation with the Biochemistry department to build a horizontal axis magnet that was capable of looking at small animals and also human limbs.
yeah.
This is all based on your work on phosphorous NMR in muscle. Could you tell me a little bit about the beginnings of the whole animal work and the human work?
Well, I think the beginning really allowed you to use a new simple technology in the design of the coils that detected the NMR signal.
Yes.
Because all your efforts in every NMR experiment was to take your sample and surround it by the coil
Yes.
so that it detects the maximum amount
Of signal.
right places.
Yes.
And we got away from that by saying we don't want all of those samples. We are very happy just with the surface of the sample and can see these signals beautifully.
Yes.
And so we started and invented the so-called surface coil.
Correct.
Now that was a very interesting development by a graduate student. I don't know if I ever met your namesake,
Gordon Wong.
Gordon Wong.
Yes.
Gordon Wong I saw again in Singapore not very long ago. And he said, my memory is exactly the same. I worked with Bob Alabama and looking at human kidney
Mm-hmm.
with NMR in an animal. And we kept getting signals, whatever we did with that kidney, from a compound called phosphocreatine, which is not in the kidney
Yes.
and must therefore come from the surrounding muscle.
Yes.
So why don't you try and cut out the surrounding muscle? Well, the only way to do it is to just focus the coil to one part of the kidney that only looks at the surface and
Yes.
not at the rest. And hence, they took the standard coil that they put into a tube and squashed it up.
And that became a surface
And
coil.
that's the surface coil.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
showed that you can do those measurements on muscle, on brain, on heart, provided the thing is designed properly in relation to the geometry of what you're trying to do.
Yes. Yes.
And that was, I suppose, a key technology
Exactly.
for the developments of that, plus the human.
Yes.
And you mentioned our colleagues at NRDC, who were not very receptive to new ideas. They never thought that the surface coil is even patentable.
Yeah, that probably was true.
They probably never thought a horizontal magnet would never.
Though they were very interested in the horizontal magnets because, if you remember, at the time, magnetic resonance imaging was becoming more and more interesting as a potential clinical utility, and they were interested in horizontal Bohr magnets.
Oh yeah.
They were mainly iron magnets at the time, so iron electromagnets.
Oh yeah.
But pushing into superconducting technology allowed higher field strengths. Now, as part of that, you were able to get funding to create a magnetic resonance unit in the Radcliffe Infirmary. And that was aimed at looking at human muscle, mainly arms and legs.
That's right.
Now, that was the start of clinical applications. Can you say a little bit about that, how that moved forward?
Well, that really opened up a completely new area.
Yes.
And in my view, actually, it closed it too soon. A magnet designed to study any muscle under any condition, I think could be an incredibly valuable tool for research.
Right.
Because muscle is 80% of your body.
Yes, yes.
You know, if you could study every bit of your muscle in every way under any condition, you'd be in a different ballpark. But that's a separate
issue, yes.
I would set up a muscle clinic myself as part of it. And I might actually do something with that. Last year, I'm talking to them.
Right.
To a physiotherapist.
Right, yes, of course.
It won't be MR.
No.
But anyway, yes, so muscle opened up a new world.
Yes.
Because you could look at the human muscle under such a range of conditions that we really studied in a relatively short time something of the order of 500 or 600 muscle cases.
Cases, yes.
People
yes.
From direct muscle diseases, from muscle fatigue, from all kinds of other conditions you didn't understand.
But there was one particular condition
Called McCardle.
McCardle Syndrome. Tell us a bit about McCardle Syndrome.
McCardle's disease really was just an index case. If you go back to our work with Steve Busby and John Griffiths and all the others on particles and phosphorylase in it and so on, that enzyme in one or few individuals is completely missing or somewhat skewed.
This is the phosphorylase.
Yes. Right, phosphorylase. And so the result of that is that these people cannot break down a major component of muscle energetics, which is glycogen or glucose. And that breakdown gives you the energies to start running very quickly, to maintain running for a long time, to store energy and reuse it, and so on. And it was well known in the literature that there were people living without this enzyme. But the consequence, they knew the description. They got tired, they couldn't repeat the experiment, they went swimming 50 meters and they couldn't complete another 10.
Right, yes.
And it was all maintaining a short burst of exercise. And that's the physiological phenomena. When we looked at it by NMR, we found that these enzymes don't produce lactic acid, the major component of the breakdown of these sugars.
Right.
And so the muscle pH is just abnormal, and within 10 minutes tell you this is worse particular condition. Right. And then having got people like that, you learned a lot of new biochemistry from when a particular enzyme you knew was missing and how they lived with it.
Yes.
And I think the most important thing we learned, the lead guy who came said, I can't dig my garden. I can't go out with my shovel and dig for about 3 minutes. And after 3 minutes, I'm incapable of moving. Right. Let alone digging again.
Yes.
What can you do to maintain my activity?
Yes.
And we said, what you do is you get over this inactivity by doing a low activity exercise so that you bring the rest of the body's machinery can do the same job, but delayed compared to phosphorylates.
Right.
So people with McCardle disease can't go on running. They can run a little bit. They can't go on digging. They dig a little bit, and they can't play with a ball.
Right. Right.
So we take him. You go and take a ball, do 3 minutes exercise with one hand, and then in 5 minutes time you'll be able to play properly any game.
Right.
And he can.
And that was a major breakthrough.
And he changed his lifestyle.
Right.
Just
yes.
because the understanding of one component.
Yes. Yes.
And I think, I always said, this is where MR spectroscopy comes in. It comes in at understanding the underlying problem.
Right. Yes.
And that understanding then can lead to advances of how to deal with it.
Yes. Now, this is around 1981, and by 1982 there was a lot of support for a clinical MRS, magnetic resonance spectroscopy research group being developed here in Oxford. And also in 82, there was now an interest in forming a society that was devoted to looking at the applications of magnetic resonance in medicine. Not only spectroscopy, but also imaging.
Yeah.
So it was recognised as a serious technology, and the SMRM Society was founded in 1982.
Yeah.
Now, that's a significant move, and you were one of the founding fathers of the SMRM Society, and you were the president from 85 to 86.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about how all that was set up? Who were the leading lights?
Well, I gave a talk to the society 4 years ago when it was in Singapore.
Right, yes.
And I went through the statistics of the first 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Year one, the 300 scientists or 200 scientists who were involved in an initial discussion whether there is any point at all of creating some sort of society out of this technology.
Yes.
It was about 200 people who were at that meeting. They went in and formed the first meeting in Boston.
Correct, yes.
200 people participating, about 150 abstract circulated, and a single thin volume of 30 pages.
Yes.
Result.
Yes.
When you say I was president in Montreal,
Yes.
4 years later, I think there were 2,500 people participating with about the same number of abstracts in 2 volumes.
Okay.
And if you follow the thing, there are now 6,000 people.
Yes.
If there was no electronic publishing, there are probably 10 volumes.
Yes, that's
meeting.
right. Of course.
So,
but this just showed the explosion in interest in magnetic resonance and the applications, especially in the clinical environment.
Yeah.
Now, all this was good for the establishing a clinical research group in Oxford. And in 1988, the MRC Biochemical and Clinical MR unit was set up at the John Radcliffe Hospital, and it was equipped with a 2 Tesla whole body magnet, and you were able to do whole body human studies.
Yeah.
The U unit is opened. What did you do with it?
Well, we obviously did the wrong thing. We did about everything we could think of, because every experiment you did was different.
All right, okay, yes.
And so you could be criticized, you were unfocused, undirected, because you just tried everything. And there was a lot of truth in that.
Right.
Why do you work kidneys and heart and brain and muscle all at the same time? You should be a cardiologist and not all of every people. That criticism was always very alive. We stuck to it on the basis that this is a new technique. It needs to be explored where you can take it, and then define the problems that you can most profitably
Yes.
tackle.
Yes.
But you can't just simply ignore the rest of it. And it turns out that a lot of the things that you didn't think it would be useful turned out to be very useful.
Sure.
So,
sure.
I think you needed that approach, and we did that approach because we were the only unit anywhere as a unit
Yes.
who were concentrating on that concept.
Yes. Yes.
And people came from all over the world to learn how to do it. Looking back, half of the experiment you could have predicted probably, but nobody did it until then.
Right.
And so
right.
somebody had to say, this is the way to go.
Right.
So I think it did its job. Now, along the line, I still feel, and will go on feeling, that because in my view, it's not comparable to a wide-ranging diagnostic technique that anybody can use and see abnormalities in. It is actually a technique that generates knowledge that you didn't have before.
This is spectroscopy.
Yes.
Yes.
That you haven't had before. And
Yes.
tells you something new so you can think about diseases in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the McCardle chap was benefited from just squeezing a bulb, a ball, actually was an advance. Nobody ever thought of that.
Of course.
Because
of
they didn't
course.
understand what the thing was doing.
Yes. Yes.
Once you have done the experiment, it's trivial.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can do a McCardle thing, spectroscopy as a patient,
Yes.
and
Yes.
study that.
Yes.
So I think you could say that my philosophy has always been that I defend the technique as one that leads to further understanding of human disease,
Yes.
and not necessarily as a daily diagnostic procedure
Correct.
like imaging.
Yes. Yes.
But it can add considerable weight to the imaging in pinpointing something you didn't know existed
Mm-hmm.
and didn't know what happened to that tissue.
Yeah.
You didn't know what happened.
Yes.
And we haven't done enough of it.
Yes. And I think that's the place where clinical MR spectroscopy is at the present moment. It's not a clinical diagnostic routine like imaging, but it is an adjunct to understanding disease and the treatment of disease.
Yeah.
Now, that allowed you to open a unit, but then you were appointed Head of Biochemistry, 1992, on top of running this clinical unit. That's increased workload. I'm amazed you managed to do it all, George. I really am. And this continued until 1996, when you became Chief Executive of the MRC.
Yeah.
And you moved from being a scientist or a director of science to being more of an administrator in science. How did the transformation happen?
That was a very difficult decision because I enjoyed the science. I realized that it's going to be different from now on. I
Yes.
tried to do as much as possible in a different way. But it's not going to be the same.
No.
And it's like actually Rex becoming a head of a college when he can probably...
This is Rex Richards. Yes.
Richard probably saying that his direction was towards the Nobel Prize, possibly. But
Right.
this never took him away from there.
Right. Right.
So,
okay.
I didn't think of mine as Nobel Prize, but the fact that it took away from day-to-day science worried me.
Right. Right.
On the other hand, can I do something different?
Yes.
So I got involved. I think had a wide range of opportunities to look at science in a different way,
Mm-hmm.
which influence
Mm-hmm.
our way we planned
Mm-hmm.
science and carried out science.
Mm-hmm.
And I did try and remain a scientist throughout
Yes.
the process,
Yes.
because I thought that was very important.
Yes. Yes.
So I maintained my own research, but obviously not at the
Expense of
intensity
others.
that
Yes.
we would have done otherwise.
Yes. Yes.
But I maintained that. But I started to think about other things. And obviously, the science of population became very important.
Of
What
course.
do you do with the hundreds of people and hundreds of millions of people who suffer from something, but you don't know what they suffer
Correct.
from and what
Correct.
you do about it?
Correct.
And how do you go and start studying it?
Yes. Yes.
And the epidemiology was quite strong in Oxford, able to look at the lifestyle, long life of individuals and make something of it. And out of that and many, many discussions grew the idea that somehow trying to understand the whole of the genetics of a human, together with the physiology of a
Yes.
human and the lifestyle of a human, would be number one in a major research organization.
So this is the genesis of
That
Biobank,
was the genesis of Biobank.
which has been
And Biobank has paid off
Yes. Yes.
hundreds of times over.
Yes.
Biobank has discovered huge number of important relationships in different diseases that are going to change the way we treat the people.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that couldn't be closer to managing medicine.
Yes.
Now, Biobank was totally opposed by half the scientific
A
community.
great deal of controversy.
Yeah.
It was too large a project, too much money was going into it, small projects were not being funded. However, it was a big project,
Yes.
and big projects need money.
Yeah. And we got the money for it.
Yes, yes.
You see, the thing is that I maintain that we would have never had that money for anything else.
Mm-hmm.
This hit even the politicians as something different.
Right, yes.
If you can't pull this off, then you can't really do big science.
Right, right.
I think he's proved wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. But it made my reputation awful.
Well, for a certain period of time, but as you
14
said,
years ago.
yeah, yes, but with hindsight, now we see
Sure.
the wisdom of setting up Biobank, and it has paid off.
Yeah.
Now, you've stepped down from being the chief executive at the MRC in 2003, and then you moved to Singapore.
I don't know what else to do.
Well, I mean, I was surprised when I heard you were going to
It was
Singapore, but there was a major research
yes,
institute being set up,
yes,
and you were invited to lead it.
yes.
And you did that for nearly 10 years.
Yeah.
How did you enjoy Singapore?
Well, I think like everything in Singapore at that time was due to one man, and that was Philip Yeo. Philip Yeo, who had vision and wanted to build up something.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he had certain supports, and one person who enormously supported Philip is Sidney Brenner. And Sidney had a huge influence on Philip's biological vision.
Right.
It's well known, I think, the quotation that Sidney said. When Philip said that, oh yes, but by training we will be very good technicians. And Sidney said, and you will remain a technician for the
Right.
rest of your life.
Yes, yes, right.
And so he set up molecular biology.
In Singapore.
beginning.
Yes, yes.
And Philip saw that the only way to build up that subject, or the general object of biological science and medicine, is to have some fundamental science doing. And that's why he got advice and was strong enough to say, I need a person who is going to lead an institute in genetics. I need a person who is going to lead an institute in bioinformatics. Somebody is going to look at imaging and put it on. And he picked me because I just retired.
Right,
To
yes.
say, would you like to come and work with me?
Yes.
Or work out in Singapore? So Philip, in a way, picked the people
Right.
for his ideas.
Yes, yes.
And his idea was to change biology in Singapore so that its fundamental science is going to be strong enough to be competitive globally.
Right, right. So you're looking at building up a multidisciplinary institute
Yeah,
for looking at biological sciences.
yeah,
Now, at the same time as doing this in Singapore, you still had work in Oxford to do, and this involved rationalisation of biological science somehow in some of the departments in Oxford, physiology, anatomy and genetics. You had to somehow combine those as a new head of department.
yeah.
How did you combine the two activities?
Well, of course, I was never going to do the university job. I've already accepted Singapore.
Right, yes.
I've agreed with Philip what I was going to do in Singapore. And then came the university.
That's right,
And
yes.
said, would you be able to do this?
Yes.
And I ummed hard and whatever. And said, all right, I'll have a go for 3 years, which
Yes.
is what I agreed to.
Yes, indeed.
It needed to be done. It wasn't a major thing, I don't think.
Okay, okay.
I think it was more to do with management of people
Right,
than it was management with science.
right.
You couldn't have changed the science of the people who were already there.
Right,
You just had to rely on it and try and manage in such a way that they believed in one another
Yes, yes,
and that they shared things between one another.
yes,
It was no sharing, no discussion, no planning, just, everybody went their way.
yes,
And all you needed is somebody to say, hang on a minute, that can't go on like this anymore. We haven't got the money,
yes,
if anything
yes,
else.
yes,
And you just had to put your foot down and say,
yes.
you're either with me or you're not.
Yes. And in fact, you did that for 3 years and you set up this Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics.
Yeah.
And it's been very successful since under new leadership after you stepped down from that position.
Yeah.
But you finished your career, shall we say, basically in Singapore
Yeah.
in 2016, and eventually you really retired in 2016.
Well, I would have, or genuinely believed when I came back and finished Singapore that I maybe had another go at something.
Oh, really? Right? Okay.
But I didn't.
You didn't.
My
No.
health, my body, my whatever did not really stand up to the kind of pressures
Of
that
course.
anything desperately new would
Right.
allow.
Right.
So you had to say, this is it.
Yes.
You either live differently, and you have to live differently, and given the personal, because these difficulties of living in with disease or illnesses within
Yes.
the family,
Yes.
it's something else. It's got to be part of your life.
Yes.
And
Yes.
sadly, but you cannot, and I still maintain, cannot do good science part-time.
Right. Right.
However hard I try, I haven't got the ideas. I haven't got the drive. I haven't got to say, this is what I need to do tomorrow morning when I'm shaving for this afternoon.
Right, right.
You know,
Yes.
if you think about what to do tomorrow while shaving, you're still doing science.
Right.
If you don't, and you can't see you're not cutting yourself, you're finished.
Right, right.
But as a human being, you have to say, that's enough. I'm not going to try and pretend I'm anything other than I am.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And see what that leads to.
Right.
And you don't know when and how. And I know for a fact that you don't necessarily have to do it the way that you would have liked to do it.
Right.
That's the way it is.
Well, on that note, George, I'd like to thank you for participating in this interview and giving us an insight into your life in science over these many years. And I look forward to seeing you many more times in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed recollecting these things that happened. And the one lucky thing that I still have, I have a memory for what I've done.
Okay. George Radda, Professor Sir George Radda, thank you very much.